Good morning and welcome to another Chat With at the St. Catharines Standard offices in downtown St. Catharines. This morning I have with me Jeff Burch, who really doesn't need much of an introduction in this community. He's been active on many levels, but right now your entire life has boiled down to helping Niagara prepare for and accept incoming refugees. So you're right now the executive director of Folk Arts.
Niagara Folk Arts Multicultural Center,
right.
Executive Director. Yeah.
And you also are, I guess, would be correct to say you're the sort of chairman of this broader committee. And I wonder if maybe the place we can start is what's that committee, what it is, who are the groups that are part of it, and what does it do?
Sure. Well, in every community, it's a little different who organizes that kind of central committee in each region. So in this region, it started in September, and the Folk Arts kind of took the lead with some public information sessions, and from that we developed a central committee for Niagara trying to prepare for the flow of refugees, and that grew to about 40 individuals from over 30 different organizations, and we've now split that into 8 working groups which are out working on issues like housing and healthcare. So it's really over the last 3 months we've really got pretty well organized in Niagara, doing a lot of work to prepare for what we think will be a fair number of refugees coming here in late January.
So there's Folk Arts, obviously, which is the hub, as it were. Mm-hmm. You've got the YMCA. Who else have you got? What other organizations are on board with you?
So we have the entire settlement sector. So our partners are the Welland Heritage Council, the Fort Erie Multicultural Center, and then we have the YMCA that does settlement workers in schools and some language assessment. We have the school boards who do a lot of the language programming. And then we also have all of the faith groups. And so they're the people that do a lot of they're the sponsorship agreement holders. So they do a lot of the private sponsorships. Mm-hmm. So we have all the major faith groups involved. We have, there's 4 or 5 regional employees helping out, which is great support from the Niagara region. And we have a wonderful healthcare committee headed by Dr. Carl Stobie, who's a teacher at DeGroote School of Medicine. Mm-hmm. He's got his whole class of medical students involved as well. So a lot of mental health professionals. So it's a really high caliber committee of people that have come together, and really impressive. I'm just impressed by how many people have stepped forward.
It's been interesting to talk to you over the last sort of month and a half, 2 months as this has evolved. And I think it's maybe worth noting, or going back to the conversation we had last week, which was, unlike some of the larger cities, which are being designated as these arrival areas for refugees, Niagara is not likely to get a couple of hundred refugees at one time. That you're expecting them to come in smaller groups. And is that because we don't have the sort of temporary housing infrastructure here to take large numbers? So this is really finding smaller places for smaller groups of people to settle.
Well, I think it had to do with the government really biting off a lot right at the beginning. I mean, they were just elected, and usually it takes a few months for them to settle in, and they hit the ground running. So they really used the 36 communities that had already had refugee assistance programs in Canada, and 7 of those are in Ontario. So it made sense for them to use that existing infrastructure. And then what's developed is we're kind of doing a hub and spoke model where we're trying to be a support for our closest refugee assistance program, which is Hamilton. So I just got off the phone this morning with the executive director for the RAP program there, and they're expecting over the next 5 days about 300 people a day to Ontario. And just as an example, on Monday they received 17 refugees. So right. Every day they're getting about 12 hours notice.
Oh, jeez.
That's how much notice they're getting. So that's going to be typical throughout the process. So what we've done is we have a communications committee that's working on a, all about Niagara kind of information package, and we have a housing committee headed up by the region and a local fire deputy chief, who will be inspecting all of the houses that people have come forward with. So we'll be able to present a housing stock and a little bit about Niagara to people as they arrive in Hamilton.
Right.
and we'll get a flow of refugees into Niagara.
So given that we don't have the degree of temporary housing, that we just move a bunch of people into a block. I mean, I know there was some talk early on of converting one of the old hospital buildings that aren't being active, but I mean, that's a huge undertaking that probably doesn't fit your timeline. So when we talk about housing and moving people into housing in Niagara, are these private dwellings? Are they apartment dwellings? I mean, what are those housing units looking like right now?
Yeah, so that still could happen. We still can end up with temporary housing. There are private companies that are out there talking about hotel owners in the area and things like that. But as it stands right now, the housing stock we're talking about is people who have come forward and said, we have some landlords who own multiple properties in Niagara who've given us a list of properties that they have available. We have individuals who've said, we have a basement apartment and we're keeping it for a refugee family. So what we need to do is go out, gather all the details such as cost. It's great to have the fire services on board because they can kind of do an inspection of those properties right away. And we can have a stock of housing that's ready to go.
And how do we cope with sort of language and cultural barriers for some of these people who I'm imagining many do not speak English?
Yeah.
They're not exactly coming from a country that has our kind of public institutions, whether they're democratic institutions or healthcare institutions. So what kind of orientation do they get? Is that something that happens when they're in their initial point of contact, or is that going to happen? Is there going to be that orientation happen again when they come here?
Yeah, so that's one of the great benefits of this committee that we put together. So two of our working groups one is settlement services, and the other is private sponsors, and they're working together on education. So in a lot of communities, you actually have a gap between private sponsors don't really know a lot about the services that are offered, and so the newcomers aren't getting the services they need as quickly as they could. Here I've already received calls from private sponsors who are waiting for families, and they're setting up settlement services in advance. So we're getting ready by preparing our services for that population, so that right when they come to our center, for example, they'll get an intake, a needs assessment. We'll develop a settlement plan for them and for the whole family.
Is language particularly difficult? I can't imagine there are very, very many skilled translators in our region who can fluently translate from Arabic to English for many of these new arrivals.
Language can be an issue, but there's ways to prepare. I have four of my 26 staff are Arabic speaking, and each the settlement workers in schools, they have a number of Arabic speakers. So we do have some capacity already, and the refugees will be in various stages of English learning. So some of them will be at the point where they can already look for a job. Others will be at the point where they hardly know any English. So it's really a matter of matching them up. They get an assessment. They're put into the correct language level. And when we don't recommend they go out and look for a job till they get to a certain stage, and then their success rate increases. So we also have, we've recently talked to the police about programs that they're going to be offering at the center to just kind of teach newcomers about the community, that the police are the good guys, and some translation as well for when people call 911, they have access to Arabic services.
How has, to your estimation, the community as a whole responded? I mean, I know Chair Caslin was it last week announced the region was ponying up $25,000 for the effort. Just in your interactions with the community, what's been the response? Sort of, you can, even if it's anecdotal, what's been the response from people to this?
Well, it's been great, and actually, one of the things we're worried about is that we'll have all this furniture and clothing and volunteers and nothing to do with it as we're waiting for refugees to come. So it's been a really good response, and we just had a really successful fundraiser at the Folk Arts Jazz concert on Friday, which we raised money for the Mennonite Central Committee. We have another fundraiser coming up later in the month at Mate Cafe. We've got all kinds of people stepping forward wanting to organize fundraisers. So you're going to see a lot of really interesting fundraising functions coming out in January and February.
I don't want to spend too much time on this point, but I think we ought to address it because it was in the news the last couple of weeks.
Sure.
And that is a certain regional councillor had taken to the airwaves and on his social media platforms to essentially say, well, any of these people ought to be considered a risk, and any of them could be the one who could, what did he say, get a machine gun and go down to. I mean, there does seem to be, beyond his comments alone, there does seem to be amongst some quarters of the community this fear that there are sleeper agents amongst this group who mean to do us harm. How do you assuage that feeling? What do you say to people to assure them that the risk is nowhere near, which it isn't, nowhere near as high as some people are saying that it could be?
Well, it's really just a matter of education, and up to 60% of the refugees are going to be children, first of all, under the age of 17. These are people that are desperate, that are fleeing their country. They're not people that are terrorists, and that kind of language, it really encourages incidents like we had reported yesterday in the Standard at the government offices, where when you have a member of the Police Services Board that is using that language and promoting that fear in the community, it really adds to a culture where people think it's acceptable. And if you really listen to the story yesterday, in the argument that this poor young girl had with these people, they used free speech as an excuse. And you're hearing that more and more. And free speech doesn't mean it's okay to bully, harass people, whether it's in the workplace or out in the community. So that's really a matter of education and teaching people what is acceptable. And we have people in positions of power, and like it or not, they set the tone, and they're supposed to show leadership. And that counselor who's on the Police Services Board blatantly violated the code of conduct that he agreed to abide by when he went into that position. And that's really what the issue is.
Is it worth noting that we have taken in as a country, and Niagara has taken in as a community, refugees before? That this is new, because we haven't had a humanitarian crisis of this scale in quite some time, but we've done it before.
Yeah, we're good at it. We're well known all over the world for it. So, and it's one of the things a lot of people are proud to be Canadian for. So, and the interesting thing is, in a lot of those situations, people kind of bring up this argument, well, why aren't we helping our own people first? Why are we? Mm-hmm. And what actually happens is when we tackle issues like affordable housing and poverty as it relates to refugees, we tackle those issues in general, and we set up infrastructure and we find solutions that will actually help our own people. So we're going to, this issue is forcing us to take a look at affordable housing. Yep. And do we have enough of it? And it will actually help Canadians in the long run, Canadians that need affordable housing.
That's one of the arguments besides the vitriol that, these are ISIS sleeper agents. Mm-hmm. There is this, I think, probably from a much more honest place, that coming, whereas, we already have poor people here. We already have people with no jobs. We already have people with no homes. And now we're going to bring more people into this mess and say, well, you need a home, you need a job, you need this, that we're having trouble getting, quote unquote, our own people. And just to your point, do you think that argument sort of sets up that false zero-sum game where it's either this or that, yes, rather than we can and we must do both simultaneously?
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is that, people can pretend to equate the two things, but someone in poverty in Canada, where they have to use a food bank or a shelter, is not the same as watching a kid wash up on the beach or someone in your family shot. Those are not the two. Those things are not the same, and they shouldn't be equated or compared to each other. So we have a responsibility both to people here at home, and we have an international responsibility to be a leader on the world stage and do our part to help people that are suffering around the world as well.
We've got a number of reader questions that have come in since we let everybody know we were having this chat this morning. But there's one thing I did want to ask you before we move on, and you had mentioned it just in passing. Obviously, as you say, these are people who are fleeing a fairly desperate situation in Syria, Iraq. The violence there, I mean, you get desensitized to it reading the news sometimes, but not for them who had to live it. So when they arrive, what kind of access to mental health services do they have, particularly for those who might be dealing with psychological trauma from the violence that they've seen, trying to get out of there?
Yeah, it's a big issue, and it's one of the first things our committee talked about, because we already know that we have a deficit of mental health services here in the region and many places across Ontario. So, that's one of those things that's going to shine a spotlight on that deficit, and we need to work on improving that. We have a healthcare committee that I mentioned already, and it's got 4 mental health professionals on that committee. And so they're working to make sure that when we're dealing with refugee families that have suffered tremendous trauma and they're suffering from, post-traumatic stress and those issues, that first of all it's identified, and secondly we can quickly refer them to somewhere that they can find help. So we are looking at that ahead of time. We know that it's an issue that we're going to face.
Okay.
Yeah.
So our first reader question comes in from Jake Snike, or Sneak, sorry if I've mispronounced your name, Jake. And he asks you, what supports are the federal and provincial government providing for these refugees, and how long will that support last?
So we're already set up, obviously, with settlement services in Niagara, and we have a really good network of services, and they're mostly funded by the federal government, Citizenship Immigration Canada, and they're augmented by funding from the province for things like refugees, actually. And so there's a network there already, and we're going to need some additional money, but there's capacity there already, and so it's going to reach a point where certain communities, depending on how many refugee families they accept, are going to need some additional funding. Maybe they have to start another English class. Maybe they need translators, things like that. So, the provincial and federal government have both said they've set aside money. The federal, I think it's over $600 million. But a lot of that will be spent in actually resettling refugees. So there will be some to augment the services we have.
And is the process of getting access to those funds as you find the need to augment some of your services, is it something that you're going to be able to access relatively quickly? Because I'm just thinking the needs of these refugees isn't something that necessarily can wait months and months and months, that if you need to make some changes or improve services, you may need those resources sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. We certainly feel, without getting too political, we feel more optimistic at the present time with the present federal government in terms of their desire to get this done. They've called it a national project. They seem to have set aside money. They're very responsive. I talk to my member of parliament a couple times a week at least on the issue. So they're engaged, and pretty confident that in communities where additional resources are needed, they'll be there.
The next question comes from Rob Jansen, and he says, the housing wait, this touches on something we've already talked about, but with a housing wait list of almost 6,000 people in Niagara, and I think he's referring to affordable housing, why are these resources not being used to help those in need in their own community when resources here are already stretched so thin?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I guess I go back to my point that it's good to shine a light on that. And again, without getting too political, we just had a regional budget where not only was none of the assessment growth spent on affordable housing, but they actually dipped into the reserves at a time when we're already short of affordable housing. So that's a message that needs to get to our decision makers. And a lot of the housing stock that we've become aware of are individual people that have called in offering us. So I'm not sure how much it's impacted that issue so far, but it's an issue that we need to look at, not only in terms of refugees, but in terms of why are there over 6,000? I think it's 6,000 families waiting for affordable housing. there's something wrong there.
When we talk about the housing, like whether it's the private sponsorships or people who are calling in and saying to you, or saying to the committee rather, will we have space that we're setting aside for refugees? Are they in affordable housing units, or like when you say there are landlords
No, they're
who are calling?
not. Yeah, they're not. So I've had two people in the community who have multiple properties, business people, and they've called in with multiple properties, so that they've set aside. So they're saying kind of, we'll do some maintenance and we'll hold on to them for a family because we want to do our part and make
Right.
sure that, so they're not coming from that affordable housing
Right.
stock. Will they in the future? I don't know, but so far, no. It's people in the community stepping forward. And in one case, we had a couple who were turning part of their house into bed and breakfast, and they were actually offering to take a refugee family instead of doing that.
Wow.
Which is a huge
Yeah.
financial commitment.
That's interesting. Brendan Morgan writes to us, and again, we're kind of covering some ground we've already talked about, but he says, I'm wondering if Mr. Burch could comment on the immediate economic costs that are incurred by various levels of government versus long-term benefits, if any, that newcomers in Canada are provided, that newcomers in Canada provide to our economy. There appears to be some long-standing disagreement in the public about this issue, and I think this is something you and I spoke about during the federal election forum we held at Matai Cafe, which was, yes, there is some cost incurred to bringing refugees over, but their net impact on the economy actually tends to be positive rather than negative.
Yeah, it is positive, and that's statistically proven. It's a very good question. Statistically, what this does is it gives an injection into your local economy. So, and this is why local communities are actually competing for newcomers and for refugees. There's competition between communities because, and especially with this, when it comes to refugees, a lot of the people who are fleeing the country are often professionals, scientists, engineers. I have one gentleman in my center who ran a factory in Syria, lost everything, but he ran an entire factory. So these are the kinds of people with expertise that are coming here, and they can be a great benefit to the economy. Many of them are entrepreneurs, and they have a great resettlement success rate, and they're a benefit to the economy. And statistically, that's just a fact.
That's one of the things I think that when people see the photos of the groups of refugees moving through refugee centers, or the shots from Europe where they're just traveling en masse, and so people don't look at that and think, oh well, there's a doctor, there's a journalist, there's these aren't just there's aren't a mass of uneducated people. These are people that from a place that had hospitals and factories and
you hear people say, well, I saw them with a phone. If they're poor, why do they have a phone? And that kind of thing. But Syria was not a poor country. They're a wealthy country. So picture kind of yourself, middle or upper middle income people in Canada, and all of a sudden your village or your town blows up, and you have nice clothes and you might have a phone, but that's all you've got. So that's kind of the situation a lot of them have found themselves in, and they don't have anything, but they're used to living a pretty wealthy life.
Is there in terms of their resettlement services, and I'm not sure how long this process would take, perhaps but if I am a professional from Syria who happens to be a refugee now, so I am a doctor, an engineer, I've worked in a specialized profession, how long does that transition take? Because there's always the stereotypical, well, he's the doctor from a foreign country who now drives a taxi.
Yeah.
What kind of processes are there to move them along if they want to stay here and settle and work in their chosen professions?
There is a kind of track for them to take, and it depends on their language level, what profession you're dealing with. So one example people always use is doctor, but that's actually the most complicated example because it depends what country you're from and what the equivalency is going to be. So it can be not that big of a deal or almost impossible depending on what country you're from. But we have programs where our job search workshop where they kind of match their credentials to find out how to reach the equivalency in Canada, and a lot of them will have to enter Niagara College or Brock University and update their.
Mhm.
But newcomers in general and refugees are extremely hardworking people. They'll work. I have people in my center. I'm always amazed. They'll have a number of children. They'll work, a couple of jobs and go to school all at the same time. They're very hardworking people.
The next question comes from Joy McGarry, and again we're kind of treading parts we've already talked about. But she writes, "What would you say to those who are opposed or even afraid of admitting refugees into Canada?"
Well, it's something Canada's always done. It's, I guess it's a matter of your personal morals and ethics, what your opinion is of it. I can speak for myself that I consider a duty as an international citizen, and especially as a Canadian, that we help with suffering around the world, that we take refugees in. Most of us have been, almost all of us have been our sons and daughters and grandchildren of refugees and immigrants. Immigrants built Niagara, they built the canal, they built the wine industry, everything that we have. So it's kind of silly to argue that we're against immigration when we're all immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants.
Do you find that there is, and I've tried to address this in my columns, but do you find that there is a fundamental misunderstanding often in the public between what an immigrant is technically and what a refugee is technically?
Yeah, and really the big difference is one of classification. So it's, there's a number of steps that a refugee goes through before they become a permanent resident. And so there's different classifications of what an immigrant is, and it's really mostly technical. Where the refugees, depending on where they're from, where that kind of differs is if it's a crisis that has to do with a warfare and that kind of thing, that you're dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress, or you're dealing with a mass migration of people, and then we don't have time to do all of the, take our time going through all the steps, and so we've had to increase the speed with which we process and do health checks and security checks and things like that. Doesn't mean that it's less secure. It just means that there's a lot of people to bring in all at the same time.
Now, when we last spoke, you said that the refugee committee was setting up an online portal where they can get access. Is that we up and running with the portal?
Not quite. It'll be up and running in the new year.
Okay.
And we've designed it along the lines of other portals from refugee assistance programs. So it'll be very user-friendly, and people will be able to donate or volunteer, and also get up-to-date information about the refugee crisis.
And where should people go right now?
Right now, they go to folk-arts.ca. All the information will be there, and we'll continue to update that website. The new portal will be a part of the Folk Arts website, but it will also be generic so that other organizations have a way for you to get to that portal.
And what kind of things does the committee need right now in terms of the things that it's looking for?
The biggest thing is fundraising, by far. So we've got lots of volunteers coming forward. We have a lot of people donating furniture and clothing and things like that, and we'll be announcing drop-offs dates in January. But we really need, what the fundraising does is it allows us to support private sponsorship groups who want to bring in a family, and they're ready to bring in a family. They just need a little more financial help. It may allow us to do things like rent storage for people's donated items, things like that. So really donations and housing leads. Those are the two things we're really looking for.
And I guess the just on the housing lead, if I think I have space for a refugee or refugee family, I mean, what should I know even before I pick up the phone or send an email? What kind of things should I know or be prepared to answer questions about when I call in?
Yeah, so it's going to be the same rules apply as with any other family. There's no special rules for refugees. It has to be safe, has to be something that you would rent out to anyone else. And so we would be asking about price, the size of the place, the amenities, and we would be scheduling an inspection. So we have a housing committee department. We've had deputy fire chief and someone from the police step forward to be on that committee. So we'll have a qualified group of people inspecting it to make sure that it's fire safe and ready. And when we've done that, it'll be added to our list, and then that list will be added to the list that Hamilton is using.
Okay. And we talk about price. I mean, assuming some of these places aren't being just offered up for the goodness of people's hearts. I mean, if there's a rent to be paid,
Sure.
Refugees, I'm assuming, don't necessarily have resources when they first arrive. Who pays for that rent? How is that arranged?
Well, they all have social services when they arrive.
Okay.
So they will have money for rent. They don't have a lot. Social assistance does not pay a lot. So a lot of the people who have come forward are people that want to help, so they may lower the rent for a year
Right.
to help out. But they will have money for rent.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do the kids get access, or are they being put in school right away, or is that depending on their language skills, I guess?
No, they're put in right away, and our settlement services committee is actually headed by Deanna Delia from the YMCA, and they run the Settlement Workers in Schools program across the entire region. They have Arabic-speaking settlement workers, and their job is to make sure that the kids go into the right schools where they have the supports that they need, and that's all done right up at the beginning.
Okay. And the website again is?
www.folk-arts.ca.
Okay, so if anybody watching wants more information, that's the place to go for
Absolutely.
now until the portal's up and running in the new year. Jeff, thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate you taking the time.
Appreciate everything. Thank you.
And we will talk to you next time on the Standard's Next Chat With. Thanks very much.